Oh, I'm thinking about you all right now as we are managing our way through the end of the term. I know that it is really overwhelming, really intense right now. Just for this class alone, you're reading Augie's book and Isla's book, which are heavy and emotional. You're working on your media assignments. We've got some heavy lecture material to get through in these next few weeks, and that's just this class. I know that you're all juggling so many other things. So I'm thinking of you. I hope more than anything that you're taking good care of yourselves, being gentle, and finding some ease somewhere along the way, even if it isn't easy, some sense of ease and peace as we make our way right now. And we will, so today I'm going to talk about residential schools. We'll tread softly and gently. There's some beautiful resources that I've also added to the Moodle page, of a short clip that I would like you to watch, and then a longer film that I'd like you to watch as well, so that we can really feel that the first-hand account. That I'll talk about that in a minute. For start, before we do anything else, so let's acknowledge and recognize where we are, where I am with gratitude, in the unceded, unsurrendered territories of Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc, in Secwépemc Ulu, the lands of the Secwépemc peoples. In my basement, where I have been a whole bunch with you guys this term. And so over the last few weeks, we've talked about technologies deployed in dealing with this thing called the Indian problem, this thing that first the British and then the Dominion of Canada identified as the inconvenient reality of the existence of people in the place that they wanted to create their new thing called Canada. And so treaties and reserves sort of dealt with the containment and the dispossession from land of Indigenous peoples, so that it could be claimed in the name of the monarchy, in the name of the crown. We still call it crown land. When it says that crown land is code for dispossessed, for Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed, so that the crown can claim it as their own. It's always a signal of our structure of cultural domination, right, which is colonialism and settler colonialism. And we talked about the Indian Act as the body of legislation that oversees surveillance, containment, regulations, who is and who isn't an Indian. And then today we're going to talk about the residential school system, and then what has been coined the 60s scoop, and which is the incredible numbers of Indigenous kids that started moving into the care of the state, and that number continues to increase. And it has its roots in the residential school system. So we'll talk about those things today. As we go, we're going to think about Augie's book, and Augie's beautiful, generous, brave recollection and reflection on his time in residential school. And then we'll move next week into thinking about relocations, forced relocations, and we'll read Isla's book. So as you're making your way through those books, I look really forward to hearing your thoughts on those. And you'll recall at the beginning of the term, we talked about tracing the chalk outlines of the crime scene. That quote that from Derek Gregory that we looked at early on in the term, that this post-colonial approach in how we're having these conversations is an act of remembrance. That's the tracing the chalk outlines of the crime scene. That's looking Augie and Isla in the eye. It's why I've offered, there's a few videos that I'd like you to watch alongside this conversation about residential schools as well. One of them's a longer film, and one of them is just a shorter clip. But it gives us an opportunity to do just that, to that act of remembrance and honoring the generosity of those willing to share their experiences with us so that we can understand better. It's one thing to sort of in the abstract understand the history of the residential school system and where it comes from, and that's important as context to prepare us to hear and listen and look in the eyes with open hearts the stories, the lived experiences and stories from those who are so kind and generous to share those stories with us. And as you can see when you read Augie's book and Isla's book, it's so brave. What they're sharing with us is so brave and beautiful, and incredible. So we're traced. That's what this is about. This is the act of remembrance, right? Tracing the chalk outlines of the crime scene. And once we get through thinking about residential schools and forced relocation, so we move into that act of opposition. So post-colonialism is those two things: act of remembrance and the act of opposition, so that we can interrupt it, intervene, stop the ongoing reconstitution, re-energization of colonial power, which is the power, the process of cultural domination, the way we've been talking about it all term. So we'll recall, just to sort of ground this conversation about residential schools in where we've come, this is the act of remembrance, right? This is tracing the chalk outlines of the crime scene. And we're always grounding our conversations in a knowing that we're thinking about colonialism as a project of cultural domination. So you've got these in the slides. I've just got the slides here. And that is premised on the baseline assumption of racial superiority. And we see that manifest in the language of the Indian Act. We see that manifested in the language of the treaties. We see how that assumption of racial superiority, the coining and identifying of Indigenous peoples as a problem, that then the Indian problem, they used to call it Indians, and we'll call that a problem, and then we'll deal with it with these technologies like treaties and reserves, the Indian Act, and residential schools, forced relocations. These are the ways we deal with the problem, right? So just the identification of people, a people as a problem, rings of that assumption of racial superiority. And that settler colonialism requires as its baseline the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from land and the elimination of Indigenous peoples from cultural distinctness. So settler colonialism, and we've talked about this over and over again, it requires the land to claim the land in the name of itself, to build its own new thing. In so doing, it needs Indigenous peoples, those who are already there, to be disappeared somehow, contained on reserves, disappeared by the Indian Act by way of the enfranchisement process. You're an Indian or you're a citizen. All of the ways that disappearing happens in real time. There's also through overt violence and genocide. And then there's more sort of subtle, ubiquitous ways that people are erased and disappeared and marginalized out so that the new thing can exist. Okay? And so the Indian Act aggressively attempted to criminalize, regulate cultural distinctness. The residential school falls in stride with that effort. So remembering you couldn't be an Indian and a citizen at the same time, the goal was to civilize the Indians, to make them citizens, as the sort of process of Canadian nation building. And the residential school system falls in line with that aggressive, the idea of it's sometimes called in some of the documents aggressive civilization or aggressive assimilation. And the notion of civilizing, that's a cultural construction loaded with that assumption of racial superiority, deployed continuously through settler colonial policy, aimed at eliminating the existence of a culturally distinct group in full. So I want to get rid of the problem, right? That's what Duncan Campbell Scott said, that quote, until there is not a single one that hasn't been absorbed into the body politic. It is about eliminating, disappearing the existing people into this new society, this new place called Canada. And so the residential school system emerges out of that desire as a way of specifically targeting kids in the aggressive assimilation process and it's been coined many times, to kill the Indian to save the child. Again, ringing of that assumption of racial superiority, that somehow being Indigenous is less than. It's not the goal. And so we created a whole school system to mobilize that effort, right? To kill the Indian, to save the child. So this is in just sort of where the language and ideology is coming from, or how it's rooted. In 1879, the Nicholas Flood Davin report reads, this is about the residential school system. The residential school is the principal feature of the policy known as that of aggressive civilization. Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. So this is from a government report stating the intent of the Dominion of Canada, stating the intention of the residential school system, which is to destroy the Indian. And so when we're talking about genocide, we're talking about sort of the genocidal implications of the residential school system, and so many of the other technologies of settler colonial power, but specifically today the residential school system. It's not an exaggeration when it's written in policy. The aim is destroy the Indian. The overt, palpable violence written into the very foundation of the school system itself is no wonder why and how it had the devastating impacts that it has had. And the idea, the overt racism. So it's overtly genocidal and overtly racist. Known as aggressive civilization, Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. And based on the British-Canadian model of ideology, civilized is good. It's the good thing. That's the cultural construction. Uncivilized is bad. So the residential school system emerges as one of the most aggressive and long-standing policies that came out of this desire of aggressive civilization, of destroying the Indian, of assimilating, of solving the final solution, of solving the Indian problem once and for all, which was to get rid of Indians. The Indian Act is designed to make itself obsolete. The residential school system is designed to help in that work, right? To get rid of, destroy the Indian. When you can't be an Indian and a citizen at the same time, destroy the Indian, you've solved your Indian problem. And so it's clearly written out in Canadian policy. Now, what is important to remember when we're talking about the residential school system, when you're reading Augie's words, is that the intention behind the school system was always assimilation. It wasn't about education. It was always aimed at assimilation, which is another word for cultural genocide. It's the same thing. When you're trying to assimilate someone into your way of being, you're absorbing them, you're disappearing them into your group. And we call that ethnocide, which is the deliberate attack for the purpose of extermination of a cultural group or identity. So cultural genocide, ethnocide, that is the deliberate elimination and attack on a cultural way of doing things and being. What we know is that when the lived real-time results of ethnocidal efforts are genocidal. People don't survive. Many people don't survive that kind of fundamental attack on their beinghood. Individuals don't survive. Communities don't survive. The depth of that violence cannot be understated. It is palpable and real. So here's just a few images to sort of included. This is a famous image of sort of success story of the residential school system. So this is the before and after photo of a young Cree boy forced to attend a Canadian Indian school. And the quote, the famous quote, and this was this image was mobilized through the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A great general once said, "The only good Indian is a dead one." In a sense, I agree with the sentiment. All the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So that's where that kill the Indian and save the child idea comes from. That's the quote. That's the passage. And then there's another series of images here. One of them is of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is here in Kamloops, Secwepemc, still standing. And then this is on the top, where on this slide you'll see that there's a link, and I've put the link also on the Moodle page to a video. It's a clip. You can watch the whole thing. It's sort of a clip of when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was here. They held their hearings at the residential school and listened and heard testimony from survivors of this particular school. And there's some incredible reflections there from people here in these territories, Secwepemc peoples in this place, in this school that we can drive by all the time. It's right over there. So I want us to ground ourselves in the voices of here. This isn't some abstract, far away thing that happened to someone else somewhere along the way a long, long time ago at all. This happened right here, and this school didn't close until 1979, which is within my lifetime. If I had been here in Secwepemc, I would have attended that school. So in terms of like, there's no separation between a then and a now, and it may very well directly, excuse me, directly your parents or grandparents or aunties or uncles might very well have been students at that school, or yourselves even. So let's, before we kind of get into thinking too far down this road of the history of the school system, let's ground ourselves in the stories of this place and this school, and so that we're hearing that and we're feeling that as we think about where the school system comes from. So the earliest residential schools were preceded by church-run mission schools, day schools, in the early 19th century. So there was an existing infrastructure of churches, not just a church, various churches. The Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches were all part of the delivery of mission schools that were sort of in part. So thinking about colonialism as a project of cultural domination, one of the ways that you culturally dominate is by dominating the ways of knowing. Ways of knowing being, learning, believing, cosmology, spirituality, all of those things. You dominate those structures. Schools are great ways to do that. They are great ways to enculturate people into the dominant way. And so the church and the state worked together from the very beginning to mobilize that desire, wrapped around with a narrative of saving souls or doing good work or educating the uncivilized or the savage. So there's all kinds of self-telling of good intention wrapped around the creation of this system, these branches that sort of do the work of cultural domination, which was about instilling and enforcing the dominant ideologies, ways of knowing, being, thinking, believing, praying. So there's an early system of mission schools, and then the federal government starts working formally with the Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches to set up the residential school system officially, so to turn the mission schools into resident schools in 1874. And then the formal agreement is entered into in 1892 after the Indian Act comes into law. And so the Indian Act is in law, and now we're going to formalize the delivery, and the number of treaties are being signed. We're going to formalize the delivery of education on reserve by way of the residential school system. Because under the Indian Act, the government gives itself responsibility to educate Indigenous children. And then the treaties, there is the promise of a school on reserve. So there's the sort of the legal spots in which to insert the residential school system are built into the structures themselves. So the goal of the Indian Act is to get rid of Indians, make itself obsolete. The residential school system emerges as a tool in this effort. Take children away from their parents, their communities, their cultural influence of their communities, and teach them how to be citizens. Okay? So because you can't be an Indian and a citizen, the idea is to get rid of Indians, create more citizens. School is a great place to do it by way of sort of indoctrinating and culturating, imposing structures of cultural domination. And you need to do that in separate from taking kids away from the influence of their families, so that they're not speaking their languages, where they have to forget their languages because the only way to communicate is in English or in French, which are the languages of the colonizer. Great tactic of cultural domination, right? Replace language, replace the form of communication, replace cosmological, spiritual, religious practices, replace everything. And one of the things that emerges over and over again in the incredibly beautiful and brave testimony of from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the archive of testimony gathered through that effort is there's sort of in the desire of the residential school is to kill the Indian and save the child. Kill the Indian so you could save the child. Right? Get rid of the Indian and then you save the child from their uncivilized ways. That overtly racist, genocidal language. The reality is, for so many, their experience has been coined and worded as what the residential school was successful at was to kill the child in the Indian, and just sort of destroy the Indian. When we're talking about kids like that, we think about that policy, that the aim of the schools, aggressive civilization. The aim is to destroy the Indian. We're talking about children. Destroy the child, and that is in so many cases what happened. So what that looks like, what the school system in practice looks like, if your goal is to create good little citizens, right? Take little kids and turn them into good little citizens. You have to quell their cultural identity completely of who they are, their individual sense of cultural selfhood, their languages, their relationships with their siblings and their cousins and their families. You need to sort of quell that, and then you need to teach them the work, the things they need to know how to do to be good citizens, in good what we would call productive citizens. So up until about 1951, the residential school system curriculum consisted of a half day of classroom study and a half day of learning a trade. And what's interesting when we think about that, for two things. One of them is the residential school system required an enormous amount of labor and effort to keep itself going. We're talking about boarding schools where large numbers of staff and students lived. So we have a school system where a large number of people, students and staff, live. So that requires an enormous amount of work to keep those places running. You got to cut wood, you got to clean, you got to cook, you got to maintain the grounds. And so the school curriculum could also be doubled as a labor pool, right? Your students are laborers, and you are teaching them things like wood cutting, carpentry, auto mechanics, while the girls are learning to cook, clean, and sew. And so you've got workers, you've got in-house workers, and lots of residential school survivors talk about how much work it was. They worked and they worked and they worked. They talked about being cold. They remember being cold, being hungry, being lonely, being scared, and being tired from always working. And that is built in directly into the curriculum. The other thing, cultural, think about structures of cultural domination. We've got a British turned Canadian class system that relies on service class, those who serve, and those who own, those for whom servers work. And so the education part of the residential school system, I would argue, really was about producing a service class, producing a class of servers who could then work for, as domestic workers, as laborers, work for the upper class owners. And so again, underscored by the overt the assumptions of racial superiority that are also built into and woven through the capitalist class system. Every example of cultural domination is embedded into the residential school system itself. But it's remembering that the point of the residential school system was never really about education. It was about enculturation. It was about teaching young Indigenous kids their place in the new society, in this new place, their social location in this new place, which was to be ashamed of their indigeneity and to have the skills to serve the upper class peoples. And enculturate them, teach them English or French, teach them the dominant religious ways, all of those practices. The Indian Act was amended in 1894 to make attendance mandatory. So that is at the same time as the formal agreement is entered into with the churches. It is mandatory to send your kids. It's written into the Indian Act. That amendment was strengthened in 1920 to make it illegal for parents not to send their children. So children ages 7 to 15 had to be sent to residential school, or their parents could be arrested. This is why, so it's the attendance at residential school is enforced by by law enforcement, because if you don't send your kids, you're breaching the law. So it's why when we see images or hear stories of when the trucks came through or kids were taken away to school, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that were taking them away to school. And if their parents refused, it was so that the law enforcement was there to arrest their parents. And so that's the quote that we looked at with Duncan Campbell Scott. I want to the final solution. Sorry, the bill that we looked at a few weeks ago. That the object of the bill is to proceed until there is not a single Indian left. That is in relation to the amendment of the Indian Act to make attendance illegal after 1920, and that was in place until 1951. And so again, like the treaty process, Indigenous peoples and settlers understood the role and goals of residential schools very differently in some cases. Some Indigenous people saw education as a tool to adaptation, just like they saw treaties and the reserves as a way of coexisting. The world around them is changing rapidly, and there's obviously nothing that can stop that change, that sort of change of colonial conquest. So how do we best adapt? And if we think about the difference between the words adapt so adapting to a changing world is very different than being assimilated into the changing world. And so colonial administrators saw it as a means of assimilation, saw the school system as a means of a final solution to the Indian problem. And the final solution to the Indian problem is get rid of Indians, right? They're gone. The genocidal elimination, whether through ethnocide or through overt actual genocide, it's about getting rid of an existing people. So there were schools in every territory and province except Newfoundland, because Newfoundland wasn't Now, interestingly, Newfoundland wasn't part of the Dominion of Canada. There were day schools and mission schools in Newfoundland and Labrador, and people who were sent to those schools have been excluded from the common experience payments and excluded from the formal apologies because the Canadian state says, well, we weren't responsible for those schools, even though. So there's court proceedings at work, and I don't know enough about them to sort of speak too much to it, but there is sort of legal action to seeking recognition of the experience of Indigenous peoples in Newfoundland and Labrador. But there wasn't a school in Prince Edward Island or New Brunswick either, and that is because there was one centralized school in Nova Scotia where all the kids from those territories were sent. So there was a total of about 130 schools, from the earliest schools to the last school, which closed in 1996. The school that closed in 1996 was in Lebret, Saskatchewan. So the school here closed in Kamloops, closed in 1979, and there were still schools operating all the way till 1996, when the last school closed. Now this is really a really interesting document to take a look at. So you've got it in the slide. This is a letter that was sent from the principal of the Kamloops Indian Residential School on November 18th, 1948. And this has gone home to the parents of students at the school. It will be your privilege this year to have your children spend Christmas at home with you. The holidays will extend from December 18th to January 3rd. This is a privilege which is being granted if you observe the following regulations of the Indian Department. So this is the school saying to parents, it will be your privilege to have your own children to come home for the holidays, but you have to abide by these rules. Number 1, the transportation to the home and back to the school must be paid by the parents. The parents must come themselves to get their own children. If they are unable to come, they must send a letter to the principal of the school stating that the parents of other children from the same reserve may bring them home. The children will not be allowed to go home alone on the bus or the train. Number 2, parents must bring the children back to the school strictly on time. If the children are not returned to the school on time, they will not be allowed to go home for Christmas next year. I ask you to observe the above regulations in order that this privilege of going home for Christmas may be continued from year to year. It will be a joy for you to have your children with you for Christmas. It will bring a joy also for your children, and it will bring added cheer and happiness to your home. So can you imagine getting that from your children's principal at school, saying it will be your privilege to see your kids, but you have to abide by these rules? Your kids that we took without asking you in the first place. And that is signed by Reverend F. O'Grady, the principal of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Now, the results of this, so we sort of have a background on where the school comes from, how the school's operating, what sort of philosophically is driving the school structure, school curriculum. The goal of the schools was total assimilation. We know that. We know Duncan Campbell Scott was very clear about that. It is about aggressive civilization. It is about a final solution to the Indian problem. And it was to be met by taking parents from their communities, suppressing Indigenous languages, and systematically negating the value of Indigenous culture, systematically negating children's sense of Indigenous selfhood. And for the most part, what people talk about having endured their schools was they did not learn how to be, there's the wording, they did not learn how to be settlers, they didn't learn how to be white, they learned how to be ashamed of who they were. Because when you systematically tear down the core of someone's beinghood, that's the message, that's the imprint. And when we're talking about the residential schools, we're talking about children. While it was sort of illegal 7 to 15, there is plenty of evidence of children as young as 3 and 4 years old in the schools, and that are in their schools for 10 to 13 years of their lives. The other thing is the schools were plagued with chronic overcrowding buildings that were poorly heated, and children that were consistently undernourished. The result is that in 1900, Duncan Campbell Scott himself, Duncan Campbell Scott, who 20 years later made it illegal not to send your children, in 1900, he admitted himself that a full 50% of children who entered the schools did not survive. So the goal is cultural genocide. The goal is the elimination of indigenous beinghood, just worded as destroy the Indian. The result is 50% of children are dying. That's just genocide. That's straight genocide. Especially rooted in the violent utterance that the intention is to get rid of Indians. Duncan Campbell Scott says it himself, I want to get rid of Indians. By 1913, Duncan Campbell Scott is still sort of knowingly, this isn't secret. This isn't sort of a secret 50% of kids are dying. Knowingly, as Duncan Campbell Scott moves through the ranks by 1913, he says, it is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein. In these same documents, Duncan Campbell Scott also refers to students and children in the residential schools as inmates. And it was widely known it was known, this wasn't a secret. In Saturday Night Magazine, in 1907, an article talking about the residential school system and the number of kids dying reads, Indian boys and girls are dying like flies. Even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as does the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. And when we think about these numbers alongside the intention, which is to get rid of Indians, there is nowhere to hide the violence. There's nowhere to say, well, we didn't know better. Our intentions were good. No, they weren't. Your intentions were overt, flat-out genocide, and you got your way. Half the kids that went into the schools didn't survive in the early years. In 1910, again, we have Duncan Campbell Scott. It is readily acknowledged that the Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. This part will give you the chills. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. There's nowhere to hide in that statement. The final solution. Again, back to the quote, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Okay, so Duncan Campbell Scott is acknowledging 50% of kids are dying. That still does not justify a change in the policy geared towards a final solution of the Indian problem. And again, he says, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that this country ought to continually protect a class of people who are unable to stand alone. This is my whole point. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. There is no Indian question, no Indian department. That is the whole object of the bill. So that is knowing that for 20 years, the death rate of children in schools is astronomical. It is still worth it to strengthen the language of the Indian Act and make it illegal not to send your children. And for those who did survive the schools themselves, the lasting legacies of pain and trauma can't be understated, or overstated. We can't. If we just think for a minute, we listen to Augie's words and think for a minute what it means to have been told from the time you're 3 years old, to be beaten when you're 3 years old for speaking your language, which is the only language you know, or you're looking for your brothers and sisters and you get beaten for that. where you get told over and over and over again that you are not good enough until you learn these new ways. It is just chilling to think about the pain and suffering and trauma that was embedded into the students at these schools. And Agnes Grant wrote a book. She herself is a residential school survivor, and she wrote a book called No End in Grief. It's a beautiful book that you might want to look up. So she herself is a survivor, and she went looking for her classmates. And out of the ones who were still alive and that she was able to locate, 90%, her findings was that 90% were alcoholic, and many that had died violent and premature deaths. So the numbers of kids walking through the doors of the schools that don't walk back out is 50%. The number of people who haven't survived the enduring pain and trauma of residential school makes that number a whole lot higher. So and remembering again, we root it back to the intention of the school: destroy the Indian, get rid of the Indian problem. This was the intended effect. This was the plan all along. And this is where I have a hard time. In 2008, when the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an apology, for example, for the residential school system, as if it was something that happened a long time ago to someone else, but what there wasn't in that apology was an acknowledgement or a recognition of the intention of the school, and that the lived trauma and pain and suffering was by design. So there isn't an ownership, I am not feeling, a sort of political or moral ownership of the stated, clear, deliberate attack, genocide, the deliberate elimination of a group. And we also need to think about the cultural constructions of children, cultural domination, cultural constructions of children and childhood. And so the British model of children and childhood. Children are to be seen and not heard. The practice of sending your children to boarding school was not new to the British model. It wasn't foreign. You send your kids away. They learn how to be good, obedient little citizens to come back and work in the factory or do whatever they're going to do. But that sort of children are seen and not heard. That was children's role in society. Children in many Indigenous sort of cultural contexts that I've had it be described to me by an Chandik Gwich'in elder as if we think, so he says to me, if the land is our soul, then children are our heartbeat. And we talked about the relationship between, of land and the network of relationships that is land. And we think about children as the heartbeat. So as the soul, the dispossession of land is at work. People's soul, they're being ripped from their ways of making a living, and you feel the pain of that in Isla's book. The forced relocation of the Saisi Dene is about people being ripped of their soul. That is what the dispossession of land looks like and lives like in Isla's words. Right? She's so generous to offer us that. So we've got the dispossession from land, from soul, and then we'll take away all the kids and take away the heartbeat. And all these networks of relationships are broken or severed or strained. People's relationship with land, ability not just to make a living, but to connect with all the things that are held in land. Children's relationship with each other, with their families, with their communities, with their land and territories. Most kids were taken way off territory, their land, to where the schools were. Language, the huge cultural linguistic diversity of Indigenous languages flattened out a deliberate attempt at the extermination of language, of Indigenous languages. Everybody was called an Indian and had to speak English or French. Identity, so sense of cultural identity, but also sense of pride in that cultural identity, community, relationships. When we're looking at dispossession from land, the treaties and reserves and the Indian Act and all the ways that the dispossession of people from land is in stride with the ripping out of children from their homes and their communities. And it gives us context to understand how devastating, how awful and devastating the implications as they land on the ground are for people. And then as communities, and you see how quickly it happens for Isla in the Saisi Dene, 10 years. It took within 10 years of being in Camp 10 and Dene Village, a third of the people had not survived. So the cycles of pain and trauma and devastation take hold very, very quickly. And then the residential school system becomes the catchment basin for children whose communities have been devastated by the loss of children. So children are taken, communities are devastated, no longer deemed to be good places for children taken back to the school. And deemed to be, again, that's by the state. So the cycles can start, and then they take hold, and the residential school system was in operation from the late 1800s to 1996. So that is a lot of generations of kids and communities and cycles of pain and violence. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about that. We're talking about the imprints and implications of generation after generation after generation that are taken into schools, and then the lived implications for their families, their communities. They leave school, they themselves. So we've got that, enough generations. You've got parents who grew up in residential school with no sense. They've never been parented. So how would they know what to do necessarily, right? There's all the guidance, all the support, all the things that happen across generations in a community are severed or lost or damaged. They're not gone. They're certainly not gone, but they're damaged and they're broke and they're hurting. And then we have the sort of well-intentioned state, the eyes of the state and the branches of child protection that says, well, this isn't a good place for kids. We'll take the kids. Okay? It all started because you took the kids, I would argue. So we'll take the kids, and then, and around it goes. So the children are taken, communities are devastated, so more children get taken. Now, in the 1952, so this is where we start moving into thinking about the relationship between the state and child and the apprehension of children outside of the residential school system into care. So in 1951, attendance at residential school stopped being mandatory. Now, as we talked about the Indian Act really tightened itself around increased restrictions to 1950, and then started to loosen up. That's as after 1950 that bands could start thinking about mounting land claims. The difference starts. It stops being mandatory to send your kids to residential schools. This is falling in stride with the end of World War II, global awareness of the implications of the Holocaust. There's a shift in a collective consciousness. Also recognition that the residential school system is quite expensive and cumbersome. So in the 1960s, the residential school system starts to wind down. Schools start to close. And if you've got schools where students are there from the time they're 3 to 15, and all of a sudden the school's closed, and where the kids going to go, right? Especially when their communities, their home communities, have been devastated socially, culturally, economically, devastated by all the other work of colonialism and cultural domination, and residential schools. We're a couple generations into the impacts of residential schools. So as it closes and decreases the amount of money that it's putting into the residential school system, the federal government increases its role in funding social welfare services, and expands its service catchments to on-reserve communities. So in 1951, about the numbers from the state, about 1% of the children in the care of social welfare agencies were Indigenous. Now that is not counting the students and kids in residential school. But up to 1951, most kids were in the care of the state, but they were in the care of the state by way of the residential schools. About 1% were in the care of the state outside of residential schools. By 1980, a third to a half of all the children in care were Indigenous, and that number has continued to increase since. Also, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular, it starts to shift in the 90s. Between 70 and 90% of the children, of Indigenous children in the care of the state, were placed in settler homes, in non-Indigenous homes. Again, the idea being that it was through either foster care or adoption that the assimilation, the assimilation work of the residential school system could be carried on, and that kids were just better off. Kids were just better off with settler families. And the overarching goal, like the Indian Act is still at work. All of those existing legislative structures that with the same ideological foundations, none of that has changed. The goal is still, whether it's spoken anymore or not, to get rid of Indians. And so the move so residential schools are shutting down. There's these kids, devastated communities. That doesn't feel right. The state says, well, that's not in the best interest of the child, right? And those of you who are in social work know about that language, the best interest of the child, as deemed to be through the eyes, the way of knowing of the state, says, okay, well, we'll take these kids, and what is in the best interest of these children is the opportunities that will be afforded to them by being in settler families. And so the majority of kids were placed in non-Indigenous households. Some were even sold to the United States, to families in the United States. As adopted for adoption. So this is what we call the 60s scoop. Is the sort of the between 1960 and the 1990s, where enormous numbers of children were not only taken into the care of the state, but adopted into non-Indigenous families. At an alarming rate. And that does not count the number of non-status Indigenous kids who were also taken in to the child welfare system and placed and adopted into non-Indigenous families and settler families. A move in the 90s, so there's a bit of move away now from that, the preference being so it had always sort of been a preference of the state to place Indigenous kids with non-Indigenous families as their best bet, right? Because the goal is assimilation, and it's still that the assumption of racial superiority is still built in and ubiquitously moving itself through all of the ways that decisions are made. The policy is mobilized, that decisions are made. And this will be very real and poignant for those of you in social work, and those of you specifically in social work who are going into child protection, which is important work. It's really, really important work. And it's a really, really complicated system, particularly when it comes to Indigenous settler relations, and thinking about thinking about all the context that brings us to any present moment, any present encounter with children and with families and with communities and with context, and good on any of you for taking up that work, because it's important work, and we need to be aware of where the policies that we're operationalizing, where their roots are and where they come from. And the child welfare system has its roots in the residential school system. It picks up where the residential school system leaves off. And we see these cycles, we see the cycles and connections, and as they take hold, we see how it happens in night spirits, and we see, I mean, now there are currently more Indigenous children in care than there were children in the residential school system at the height of its operation. And that is for all kinds of complicated reasons, but not complicated and not unrelated reasons. So I'll get you to start just thinking about, okay, these cycles are real. Reading Isla, read Augie, watch the videos. These cycles are real. What do we do? What has to happen to break them? Where does change happen if we're not just going to keep now folding a whole new generation of Indigenous kids into the care of the state because the state still thinks it knows better. It knows best how to care for Indigenous kids. That's where the residential school system started, with the intention of getting rid of their indigeneity and turning them into good little citizens. Then we close the residential school system, and then we just adopt little kids, and I'm not saying just in a dismissive way in any way, adopting kids into non-native families or non-Indigenous families, because it just picks up the work of assimilation. So meanwhile, these cycles of devastation on the ground continue. So what do we do with that? Is really the question. And so let's talk about that in seminar, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. So I'm going to post this. I'll post a couple of movies, the videos I'd like you to watch. Be gentle with yourselves as you're thinking through these things. This is not easy. This is not an easy place to go, and it's a really important one. It's a really important one to look Augie in the eye and hear his story and think about what he can do, what he offers us as guidance to where we go from here. Alrighty, I wish you well. Take good care of yourselves and each other. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this, and next we'll talk about forced relocations. Take good care. Bye.